Hi everyone, my name is Will Hurd. I'm the founder of Hurd by Hurd LLC, and today I'm going to be showing you a video game that I created to demonstrate the effects of sound pressure levels in changing altitudes. Let's take a look. Now, before I dive into the actual video game itself, I do want to talk about some of the inspiration I had to make this project altogether. During my time at the Blackbird Academy in Nashville, I had this fantastic professor named Mark Rubel, and one of the questions that we talked about was whether or not you could 100% soundproof a studio. Mark's response was, in theory, yes, but practically, no. And I sort of took that personally. I decided to try and make him a special project that he wouldn't forget. What I was trying to prove was that a studio could be 100% soundproofed if it's suspended by magnetic levitation. As you can see here, I did some woodwork. I bought this little cheap magnetic floating device thing. I'm not really sure what you call it, but essentially this magnet right over here sits and floats with no contact. The idea was to place this miniature studio with a speaker inside, suspended by magnetic levitation, and then sealed inside of a larger container. This container is routed to a vacuum pump, which I then pumped all of the air out. And as I was playing music, the air pressure dropped, and thus the sound pressure level dropped. I decided to include a report on this as well. You can see that as the absolute pressure approached 0 psi, the sound level in decibels dropped dramatically. I then took this a step further and decided to relate this project towards altitude, air pressure, and sound intensity. I borrowed the barometric formula equation from Wikipedia, as well as the sound pressure level equation. Now, it's important to note that this barometric formula assumes a temperature lapse rate of 0. We could theoretically model this using these two equations shown here and here. However, for the sake of simplicity, I thought that it was safe to assume that the reference temperature was constant. So after going through this whole report, I realized that the practical application to this project was really in regards to altitude versus sound level. The higher we increase our altitude, the lower the pressure, and the lower the pressure, the less air molecules there are to transfer acoustical energy. So what the heck does this have to do with building a video game? Well, I wanted to create a game that as you change altitude, the sound actually mimics real-world physics and attenuates properly. In order to do this, I created a very, very simple game. It consists of 4 different levels, each level corresponding to a different height. So we have one at sea level, one about 9,000 meters up, one about 17,000 meters up, and one all the way up in the stratosphere at about 32,000 meters. I also created little elevators that'll take you to each platform. Lastly, I created a sound object on every level with a collider that triggers a sound. Unreal Engine's stock third-person character was used. For the elevator, I created a simple enclosure and also included a box collider to trigger the elevator. The elevator blueprint is relatively simple, with an on-component begin overlap triggering the event. There is then a check to ensure that the player is the object entering the trigger, which is then routed to a timeline that outputs a lerp vector, with the starting position and the ending position as inputs. The return value of the lerp vector then acts as an input for the set relative location function. As for the SFX object, this was really just simply a cube with a sphere collider around it. The interesting piece really lies in the event graph. We have a basic sound triggered on collider overlap, with a check to ensure that the player is the one entering the collider. If that check succeeds, this ding-dong sound effect will play. Now, in terms of relating all of this air pressure and altitude into this blueprint, the first step was to get the height of the player in meters. We have a simple getActor location that splits the array into 3 different vectors, and from that z vector converts centimeters into meters. Once we have the height, we're ready to plug and chug. This math expression calculates the atmospheric pressure in relation to sea level pressure. Remember this guy? So now that we have the pressure in relation to the player's height, we can then calculate the sound pressure level. I broke this equation out into 3 different math expressions just for clarity's sake. First, we have the pressure over the threshold of hearing. We then take a logarithm of that value and multiply it by 20. This last step takes the logarithmic ratio of the maximum sound pressure level at the given height h to the max sound pressure level at sea level. This returns a value in between 0 and 1, which we then add to the volume multiplier of the play sound function. I also included a print string function to display that ratio each time we trigger the sound. Lastly, I borrowed a widget blueprint from YouTube to display some of the metering levels of all the sounds in the game. Finally, it's time to see this in action. Here we are at sea level, and pay attention to the meter on the left. As you can see, that ratio is 0.999, or almost 1. Let's take the elevator up, in the world's fastest elevator of all time. And here we are at around the height of Mount Everest, which is about a 10 decibel reduction. We'll then ride up to 17,000 meters, which is about where a Concorde jet flies, and we get about a 21-ish decibel reduction. Lastly, let's head on up to the stratosphere. Here we are at 32,000 meters, about a 49 decibel reduction, which is almost inaudible. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of these numbers that we've used could actually be converted to variables. We'd have the ability to play around with gravity, the molar mass of air, or in other words, the type of fluid being used. We could even play around with density and temperature. In general, there's a lot of flexibility with this solution, and it could be applied to ultra-realistic games where altitudes are changing very often. This could be applied to games with interplanetary travel, where other planets might not have the same properties like the ones that we have on Earth. Well guys, that's a wrap for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Peace.